Okay, so Mike, just to reiterate the question, it's how can the Sustainable Development Goals reflect the concept of an ethical city? Okay, Brendan, John, or Ralph, who'd like to tackle the question of the SDGs in relation to the concept of the ethical city?
I'm happy to kick it off, and then if Brendan or John want to come in, then and correct me and expand, because I see there's a question from Joe also in the chat, so I can sort of double up there. I mean, and I think my answer to both questions, there's kind of things to say across both of them. And the first thing I'd say, I'd very much like to welcome the comments that have been made from all of the panelists in particular, and also the opening remarks. I think there's lots of food for thought in there. I guess I would preface my address, my response, I guess, by saying that I personally don't separate the terms ethical and city. For me, this is a collective endeavor. It's not about a bunch of individuals acting ethically as much as it is about us collectively finding ways to recover and develop the codes, values, and practices, collective practices, institutions, interests that we need for the future. So hence I'm less emphasizing of individuals, but more emphasizing of the collective. And cities, I think the case has already been made for why cities, so I won't go there. I do feel that I have to say something about climate change. I mean, anyone that knows my work will know that it's all been about climate change, and so my passion for alerting what I feel as many people as possible to the climate emergency, the crisis we face, is undiminished. In fact, it grows stronger. But in parallel with that, I increasingly recognise the abject failure of ecological modernisation and the whole eco-mod project. And by that, I really say the dangers of linking decarbonisation through the neoliberal, as some people have called it, project are becoming increasingly obvious and paramount. And if we continue to, I think, kid ourselves that we can make progress in addressing the climate emergency through an unencumbered market-based approach, we are doomed. We're doomed because each turn of the wheel on that ecological paradigm creates more disadvantages for those who are most vulnerable, and that can only end one way. So I personally feel that tying inequality and the climate emergency together very tightly is critical. It means the alignment of institutions and interests, as I said, between eco warriors, I'll call myself one of those for the moment, and those who are committed to social equity of all sorts. And I think that those interests haven't always been aligned, and we need to do that urgently. And I recognise, and I really, I think Brad's comments were really, for me, very well thought and very well founded. And so I might just briefly comment on this idea of governance. I think I recognise a book to a large extent is a rallying cry, but hopefully one that kind of resonates and brings people together that perhaps wouldn't have been prompted to bring together. And that's where I'll link back to the Sustainable Development Goals. I feel the Sustainable Development Goals are a kind of, in a way, a kind of common code or common language that we can, across quite a wide diversity, geospatial, classes and so on, subscribe to something that we connect to as a kind of central organizing idea or set of ideas, or 17 of them in the case of the SDGs. And for that, I think they have utility. Now, how much utility and how we press them to work for these ends that Brad was talking about, I think there's a lot in there, and of course I sort of I feel like the ethical city, in a way, I almost muse on this point that you know, cities are competitive. I mean, in a way, cities were constituted as centres of competitive advantage, and that they continue to be so despite COVID and despite everybody rushing off to the country. The future of cities is assured from the point of view of that kind of competitive co-location, despite digitization and so on. I'm convinced of that. And I kind of think the idea that we could be involved in a competition for what cities collectively can be most ethical and most committed is kind of a strange but kind of quite attractive proposition in a way. Anyway, look, I think I've attempted to address those two comments. Joe, I probably haven't got to grips with this one, but I would say it's about the collective endeavour, and I recognise the challenges in that that Brad pointed out. But I feel that that's what it's all to play for, really. Is how do we reconcile in this struggle in effect the need for openness, transparency, representation, to hear everyone. And yet to have those goals set and as collective anchor points out into our shared future.
Great, thank you, Ralph. Thanks for responding to both those questions. I might hand over to Brendan perhaps next. Another question that's come up in the chat is, how do we incorporate business more directly in the ethical city framework? What about pushing the notion of corporate urban responsibility as a means to bring the private sector to the table more effectively? Would you like to offer some thoughts on that and any other aspect of ethical cities, Brendan?
Well, actually, that's where ethical reading is very interesting, because it actually is driven by business, as far as I understand, or business representatives coming together. So it's already one example of how businesses can be more effectively engaged in the urban agenda. So I would suggest looking there as a start point. But what we also tried to do was to reconfigure our notions of how business operates within cities. And we tried to give lots of examples of what's going on. For instance, things like community wealth building, where business feels like it has roots in the city, it has roots in the community, and it has a responsibility to work with the community in order to achieve the goals that the community has, and also to respond to the problems that they face. That's very different to the Amazons of this world, who don't want to pay taxes and don't really want to be part of the locality. So we talked a lot about, for instance, different forms of business, cooperative approaches and so on, which I think is really interesting. And we're going to see more of that, I think. The other point I'd like to make is that, and I think it connects into what Mike was saying about post-crisis responses. I don't think there's going to be such a thing as post-crisis. I think we're just going to tumble from one to the next. And so it's really a matter of how do we respond to that situation where we're in the pandemic, we've got climate change going on, we've got digitization and everything going online. So that's having a huge impact on our cities. It's decimating high streets and so on. So what I think we argue as the core is that we need a progressive agenda. We need to actually look at these trends and direct them towards our goals rather than be a victim to them. So really cities have to engage in that. And the good thing is that lots and lots of things are happening. So we give numerous examples of, say, for instance, basic income experiments in different parts of the world, or community wealth building, participatory budgeting, climate action plans, and climate assemblies, citizen assemblies. This is, I think, examples of fighting back against these powerful forces. And I think it's also examples of recreating, reinvigorating community and trying to reinvigorate the demos as well. So I think that's the beauty of what we've been able to do so far, is just to point to all these different examples of what's happening.
Great, thank you, Brendan. We have some further comments in the chat, which I might throw over to John. One question from Georgiana Varna is, would an ethical city welcome and host multiple forms of community land ownership? In the UK, it's difficult to imagine ethical cities with such levels of current complex and inequitable land ownership patterns, along with crushing extensive privatisation of public spaces and our public realm. Very pertinent questions for ethical cities. So over to you, John.
Oh, thank you, Jago. You've given me the easy one. I think when we talk about ethics, ethical practices, ethical cities, we do tend to feel a warm, rosy glow. But as Mike said, that the point of our research and activism is not so much to study the city, but to change it. And change brings conflict and contestation. And I've often been told that if people aren't opposing you, then you aren't doing enough. You aren't ruffling the system enough. The point is, I think, to make that a very heartfelt intellectual endeavour rather than a more, sort of physical conflict one. And what Brendan gave before with his examples from the book was a whole range of democratic processes for dealing with and working with contestation. And that was where I would think that where we look to alternative forms of land ownership, of course it would be very welcome in a city that's working to more ethical ways of being. And there'll be contestation about that. Those whose situation and wealth is threatened will oppose it the most, no doubt. But slavery was also changed. And many people's vested interests were changed by that. And so I would look towards a more activist approach to operating within ethical means to bring resolutions and more win-win situations.
Great, thank you very much, John. We're 5 minutes to 8, so we'll be wrapping up very shortly. I'd like to throw back to the panel, the author panel or editors panel, for any last comments you'd like to make about the book.
I will go in first because it'll flow on from the last question I was answering. But before I do, I'd like to give my special thanks to Brendan and to Ralph for being great colleagues and the way they're able to carry me through the process, and I learned so much from it, and thank all the speakers and panelists and audience tonight. In terms of contestation and process, I'd really encourage you to read the short case study in chapter 2 of the book when you get hold of it, because it talks about a Turkish case study of rights to land and housing when a council has decided to appropriate shantytown land for private development, and the way that the largely women's organisations were able to resist and to counter that in a very successful way.
Great, thank you, John. Ralph or Brendan, any last comments?
Oh, look, I'd like to redouble my thanks for the very thoughtful comments from Wendy and also from Andrew and Brad. As I said, there's a lot of food for thought in there, and the book. I mean, I like to think. I hope that the book is not too presumptuous in taking a kind of platform, but more a provocation for us all to redouble our efforts and think and reflect. And I think that's where I particularly would single out Wendy's comments. I think is in encouraging us all to, you know, initially step back and kind of collect one's thoughts. And that's what I hope, if in some small way this book contributes to that kind of mode of thinking about cities. So that's my parting comment. And thanks everybody for participating. And certainly, if anyone has questions or comments, I'm very happy to have dialogue offline, or in various ways, and take some of these projects forward into the future. So always looking for that conversation and to find ways in which we can turn some of these, as I say, these kind of rallying cries into concrete action. Thank you.
Thank you.
Brendan, last comments?
Yes, firstly, I'd like to thank you, Jago, for chairing this session, and also our keynote speakers and panelists. Really very rich contributions from everybody. In addition to that, I'd like to thank the artist whose work we used on the book cover, Louise Soloway Chan. It's actually artwork that you can find in one of the Hong Kong metro stations. I just happened to be there one time, took a photo, shared it with Ralph and John, and they agreed that we should go with this. It's sort of, you know, the energy, the dynamism of city life is captured in this photograph. The other thing I'd just like to mention to everybody is that we are rerunning our Ethical Cities open course on FutureLearn starting today. So if you want to continue this conversation, please go over, join us on the MOOC. We'll be basically continuing this conversation for the next 5 weeks, requiring just a couple of hours a week. Already people are in there, and I think it's going to be a great experience. So I look forward to seeing many of you online. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Brendan. Look, I'd like to thank all of the presenters tonight. Professor Mitsuho Ikeda, Emeritus Professor Mike Berry, Associate Professor Wendy Steele, Dr. Andrew Hollows, Professor Brad Hooker, and also our editors and authors, John Fien, Brendan Barrett, and Ralph Horne. And I'd also like to thank Marie Scott, who's not visible to anyone in the session, but who assisted immensely with the logistics and organising of the session. I know it's always a little bit tricky doing things electronically, but it's gone particularly smoothly, I think, tonight. So I think we'll finish up the session. We're after 8 o'clock, and I'm sure many of us would like to go and have some dinner. But I think it's been a really fruitful, interesting conversation. We've had some great presentations and comments from everyone, and some really terrific questions from the audience as well, which have tested the resolve and interest of our panelists. So thanks everyone, and really great to say that Ethical Cities is now launched.